to be here today to be in conversation with the 4 people you see on this screen. And just to give you a little bit of context here, so we've titled this webinar, Rethinking Capacity Building, a cohort model for resilience and results. And the context here is over the past few years, at Dalberg, we've had the privilege of working with really many of our partners to build and sustain these cohort programs to drive impact, really in a systemic way. And what we found is that in broader conversations, this model we know has demonstrated very strong results, but it's still quite underutilized across the ecosystem compared with more familiar one-on-one capacity strengthening approaches. So the objective of this session really is to bring together organizations from both sides of the grant to really think about how more collaborative cohort-based models are helping to shift how we think about capacity support, really in service of more resilient, high-impact organizations. So we're doing a little bit of scene setting here, and I will continue to frame up the conversation. We'll then move into the panel discussion, and then finally, we are going to have a little bit of time for Q&A. So for those of you on the call, please do put in your questions into the chat, and I'm hoping we'll have a little bit of time for that at the end. Next slide. So wanting to very quickly introduce the panelists on the line, I'm just going to give a quick one-liner, and then we'll have a lot more time to get to know them all when we get to the discussion. So introducing CC Moore, who is a director at the Office of the President at the Kellogg Foundation. CC has helped lead the development and launch of the Foundation's 90 million global challenge called Racial Equity 2030. This is a cohort program that builds and scales ideas for transformative change focused on racial equity itself. Linda Wazert, who you see on the line here, is the Global Director for SIF's Global Equity, Gender and Youth Portfolio. And SIF, as many of you know, has been pioneering portfolio-level cohort programs across Africa and Asia, really taking an organizational development lens. And Linda has been leading the development and launch of SIF's most recent cohort program. We're also joined by Nancy Omondi, who's a program manager at Ujamaa Africa. They are a non-profit dedicated to ending gender-based violence across many countries on the continent, and Ujamaa recently participated in SIF's most recent cohort program. And last but not least, introducing Sonia Park, who is the Managing Director of Strategic Engagement at Namati, a non-profit advancing social and environmental justice by building a movement of people who know, use, and shape the law. And Namati is currently participating in the Racial Equity Cohort Program. So a very warm welcome to everyone on the line. Next slide. So very quickly then, you might be wondering about who I am and who Dalberg is. So very briefly then, we are a social enterprise focused on building a more inclusive and sustainable world. And we are privileged to be doing this work with so many of you on the call. And our mission, as shared by many of you here, is about building a more inclusive and sustainable world where all people can reach their full potential. I personally lead our talent and leadership practice, which is all about helping individuals, teams, and organizations unlock the best version of themselves to have the greatest impact. So this work is particularly exciting for me when we think about cohort programs, seeing them as a really powerful way to put that shared mission into practice, building individual and collective capacity and organizational strengths to drive the impact that we seek to create. So with that then, moving to the next slide. So you might be wondering, what is a cohort? What is a cohort program? So a cohort is a group of organizations who move through a structured journey together, engaging in reflection, peer exchange, and critically applied learning around a common set of goals or challenges. So a cohort program is really in reflection or in opposition to one-on-one capacity strengthening support. Both are very complementary. So let's do a little bit of framing then before we get into the discussion. Next slide. So just wanting to start here by sharing that now we know what a cohort is, thinking about how a cohort program itself can typically take 4 forms. So we have done a lot of work with organizations across these different forms. The first is intra-organizational cohort program. So this is where we've worked with the likes of Women's Well Banking to design cohort programs within an organization to grow and shift ways of working. The second, as embodied by Linda's work here at SIF, is really a portfolio approach. So working with a portfolio of grantee partners to build and hone organizational capabilities, leadership capabilities. Challenge Fund is another archetype embodied here by the work that CC and the Kellogg Foundation are doing. So this is around applicants, finalists, and awardees that apply to a challenge, and through that process go through a multi-year process to strengthen their models for deeper impact together. And then finally, an ecosystem approach, which is really about bringing organizations from across the ecosystem to drive change together. Next slide. So we're just going to spend a few minutes here to think about the why. Now we've talked about what cohort programs are. Why do we believe these are particularly valuable? So I'll just give a few examples here. So the first is really about how they can strengthen relationships between grant maker and grantee partners. So you can see on the left-hand side, sort of the more traditional grant maker grantee partner relationship. So it tends to be unidirectional. It tends to be mostly about flows and funding. And what these organizations on the line embody is much more value-added, multi-directional relationships. So on the right-hand side, you can see how there are flows in knowledge, expertise, and learning across and between all of them, which can shift power in the process. Next slide. We also see that these kinds of cohort-based programs can unlock impact at multiple levels. So that could be around changes in self, changes in interpersonal relationships, changes in organizations, and changes across the system. And the organizations here have experienced different facets of this. And then next slide. Finally, just to share here that there is a lot of evidence emerging here around how cohorts can offer a transformative, scalable solution, whether that's around accelerating skill building and sense making through peer-to-peer learning, whether that's around real-world sharing, or the group structure and shared journey that can drive impact versus more of a one-on-one program. So with that in mind then, we are excited to welcome our panelists to be in discussion around their own experiences of cohort-based programs. So we can take the slides away, and I will first invite Cece to answer an initial question. So as I mentioned before, Cece, you've been very involved in designing and launching Kellogg's Racial Equity 2030 initiative. And in our view, it's a very unique program because of its 8-year scope, flexible funding, and very much a grantee-shaped MEL process. What I'd like to understand from you is, why did you choose a grantee cohort model as the model to drive impact? And how has this model helped your grantee partners to increase the impact that they are having?
Well, thank you so much, Tanya, for the wonderful introduction and the opportunity to talk about Racial Equity 2030. I'm grateful to be on this call with one of our partners of that initiative, Sonia with Namati. And, I think deciding to go with the cohort model for us as part of this challenge was a bit of an evolution, actually. We had supported cohort models before in what I would consider a big tent approach, right? So it's opening up the net as wide as possible to, be able to provide a bit of support for partners as far as capacity building or technical assistance. And what we learned from that approach is that you can get a great richness of different types of solutions and visibility, but sometimes that approach can be a bit unequal for some of the participants within that big tent. And so as we were thinking about Racial Equity 2030, we knew from the onset that we wanted to have an approach that had the ability to uniquely ground our DNA, which we call racial equity, community engagement, and leadership development into the process itself and not just out in the outcomes. So we really started to think, well, what does that look like from this perspective as well? And we started to call it Cohort Light, right? Where we were going to bring people together, but we didn't want to prescribe or define for them how they needed to participate within that cohort, but we wanted them to have opportunities to build and learn with each other. So we started to refine towards deeper and more depth around how we structured the cohort. And so that was an opportunity for us to work with folks like Dalberg to offer more personalized technical assistance, coaching, and peer learning exchange opportunities for the cohort to engage in. And we, had a long-term vision for this challenge, as you mentioned. It started in 2020, and at the time that the grants were awarded to the partners, they had an 8-year arc of partnership with us, which also was very intentional to think about the design and the amount of learning that they would be able to do in their own capacity, but also in this cohort structure over that period of time. Another thing I would just add to that is we provided some upfront funding for these organizations to build their own capacity to think in this longer term outcome perspective, and also for them to be able to participate in peer learning opportunities and engage the subset of people that they would need to accomplish goals over an 8-year period of time.
I appreciate what you're saying, Cece, about this notion of it being an evolution, that coming to a cohort approach wasn't ready-made, and you lived your way into it and landed as this model as the most effective way to really drive the racial equity objectives you had for the program. Thank you. Linda, so SIF has also been at the forefront of cohort programs, but you've really approached it from an organizational development lens. And there have been 4 cohort programs that SIF has designed and delivered over Africa and Asia over the past 3 years. I think what's very interesting in SIF's approach is that you have done it around very specific functional themes. So a cohort around MEL, a cohort around leadership, a cohort around DI most recently, for example. So I'm curious to understand, why did you decide to use this functional approach? And similarly, what lessons have been learned along the way?
Thank you so much, Tanya. It's such a pleasure to be here alongside Cece, Sonia, and Nancy from Ujamaa, who, as you said, is one of our cherished partners and has participated in one of those core programs. By way of context, so as part of our commitment to strengthening our partner organizations and the various ecosystems in which they work, we funded a number of cohort-based capacity strengthening programs across a number of geographies and functional issues, as you mentioned. So yes, you highlighted the evaluation and leadership program for evaluators based in the Global South. We funded our Africa leadership program, an evidence monitoring and evaluation program in India, and lastly, our DI program for Africa-based partners. So these are the 4 flagship programs that we funded since 2022. And really, I think what informed this functional approach were basically 2 things. Most importantly, number 1, it was about what our partners wanted and needed. We have what we call an organizational capacity assessment tool that we share with partners, where we ask them to let us know about any specific gaps in their organizational development strategies or current capacity. And those answers essentially have informed the kinds of topics that we have chosen for our cohort programs. And then I think the second one is really more about what are the ecosystem trends, challenges, and opportunities that we're trying to address. So whether it's about leadership or inclusion or monitoring and evaluation, these are all very current key issues that our ecosystem partners are grappling with, really with a view to staying impactful and resilient in this current time. And then on lessons learned, across the board, I think I would highlight 5 lessons for us. So the first one is the capacity building is about people. It's not just about skills, right? And cohorts for us have served to build trust and peer support and shared learning that lasts beyond the training itself. And our participants have told us that what they valued most, or even more than just technical knowledge, is networks and relationships. I think the second key learning for us has been that resilience comes from shared ownership and strategic collaboration. So the cohorts have really served to create communities that problem solve together. So in the case of our EME cohort program for Asia and Africa, for example, participants ended up proposing joint thought pieces and funding proposals and, a lot of sort of strategic collaboration that we wouldn't have seen otherwise. Then the third learning, I think, is around the fact that localized and context-specific approaches matter. So what works in one region may not work in another, right? There's a specific cultural, social, and institutional context that needs to be taken into account. And so embedding flexibility and co-creation with local partners and coming up with a tailored program is what leads to stronger and lasting outcomes. Then just briefly, two learnings that I want to highlight, two additional ones. The peer learning is what multiplies impact, right? So the cohorts are about participants not just learning from the facilitators. In this case, Tanya, obviously you played a key role in facilitating several of the programs we worked together, but it's also about learning from each other, as Cece has said, right? So it's about, building confidence. And I think a lot of the innovation comes from that, right? So knowledge doesn't just come from the expert or facilitator in the room, it comes from everyone in the room. So for example, during our DI cohort program, all of the organizations use the insights they gathered from their peers to come up with innovative solutions to some of the DI issues that they had identified, right? And that fed into their policies and action plans developed as a result. And then I think the last one is a basic one, but it's that measuring results doesn't just mean looking at numbers, right? So it's not just about how many people participate in the program, but how do they apply the learnings? So this focus on action-focused learning is key for accountability and impact and sustainability. And it doesn't just apply to grantee partners, it also applies to us. So for example, in the DI cohort program, it was as much about CIF learning from our grantee partners about what works as it was about sharing what we have done in that space. So learning for us is a two-way street.
Thank you so much, Linda. There's a lot of richness in what you're sharing. I'll just pull out two pieces that really struck me. So in response to this notion of this functional approach, it's been very demand driven. The reason why there was a DEI cohort in Africa is because Africa-based partners wanted to understand, what does DEI mean for us in the African context, and how can we use that to strengthen the impact we're having on the ground. So that I wanted to highlight that. And I also love the last piece you shared about this notion of it being a two-way journey. We also often think about capacity building. It's come from a sort of colonial mindset of how does the global north capacity build the global south, if you will. And what you're speaking to is a cohort model, when designed in the way that you've done it, can enable bi-directional learning, where capacity is strengthened and organizations are strengthened from both sides of the grant. Thank you for that. Right, moving then to our grantee partners, would love to hear from Nancy and Sonia. So as grantees, Ujamaa and Namati recently participated in different cohort programs. My curiosity is, from a grantee perspective, what did you take away most from that experience, and how did it differ for you from the traditional approach to capacity strengthening or organizational development that funders might do? And I'd love to hear from Sonia and then Nancy.
Thank you, Tanya. The Racial Equity 2030 cohort experience, it's unique in a couple different ways. As Cece mentioned, that 8-year time span is really rare and really unique in philanthropic partnerships. And our cohort is relatively small in size. We have 5 core organizations that go through this journey together. And then within that small group, we actually have incredible diversity of experience. We have an organization working on, for example, Indigenous youth empowerment in Hawaii. We have an education justice organization in Brazil. We have a group working on intergenerational racial healing in Chicago. Namati works globally on land and climate justice issues through legal empowerment. So there's actually incredible richness and diversity, even in that small group. And because of that time span and the size and the diversity of the cohort, I would highlight two particular benefits that I've experienced. One is over time, as we get to know each other, other cohort members, I noticed that we're spending less time on explaining our work to each other, and we're spending more time drawing out deeper lessons from each other's work. We just, earlier this year, we spent a few days together in Sao Paulo. And the group that co-hosted, the Brazilian group that co-hosted that convening with the Kellogg Foundation, on surface, they work on completely different things from our work. But as I got to know them over the years, and as I spent days with them in Sao Paulo, I noticed a lot of powerful similarities between our work and theirs. For example, things like how Afro-Brazilian communities stayed resilient and resisted oppression and discrimination for generations through art, through active care, through intergenerational connections. And those active resilience and resistance strategy is what I see in our work, our own work of legal empowerment. And it is very much needed in this time, especially. So it was really moving and powerful to see those connections that I don't think we would have been able to see if this was a one-off group meeting just on a specific topic for in a one-off way. So I really appreciate what this long time horizon allows us to do to draw out that deeper learning from each other. And the other benefit I would highlight is it very much echoes what Linda shared. It's trust. The trust that we are able to build over time. And to me, in our own experience at Namati, that's not a nice to have. That's a crucial ingredient for any learning activities to be successful. Like our organization have spent more than a decade really building global solidarity and meaningful human connections. And that's how we were able to generate sort of exponential growth and demand for learning within this network, people wanting to show up and share what they're experiencing and what they're learning with our network members. So we've seen in our own work what that trust does. And how that makes any kind of learning activities more effective. And so I really appreciate the how the Kellogg Foundation is allowing that trust to come out and emerge through careful design of this cohort experience and also through that long time horizon.
Yes, thank you, Sonia. So again, speaking to the cross-pollination that a longer term of a longer time frame of a cohort program might enable between organizations, and then also this piece around improving and strengthening the grant maker grantee partner relationship as well through trust, as you said. Nancy, same question for you then, sort of your takeaway here around the experience of being in a cohort program and how the cohort program might differ to more traditional approaches that you've experienced.
Thank you so much, Tanya. Thank you, everyone, for this opportunity, and thank you for those who are participating. So for us, we are beneficiaries of the cohort that has just ended, the DI cohort that has just ended. I will not say it has ended per se, because we've learned quite a number of things and we've established networks that we are still in communication with other partners. So for us, this was a very big shift in terms of how do we define and look at capacity building. Most of the time, I think from the previous interactions we've had with funders, capacity building was more of a framework shared by a donor, and here you are, this is what you're expected to do. But this had some kind of power shift. It was more of us. It was encouraging the peer-to-peer learning and a shared journey where we had the position of even expressing our vulnerability with our peers who were in the same cohort with us. So in our cohort, we had Jacaranda, we had Camfed, we had 1 Acre, and some of them were way, way ahead in terms of just integrating DI into their different interventions. But for us in Jacaranda, we were just starting. So the initial stages were a bit uncomfortable, but the way the platform was set for everyone, it gave us that opportunity to be able to just share with our peers, the ones who are ahead of us and the beginners who are starting like Jacaranda. So by the end of the day, we also got to learn. For those who had gone far ahead of us, what did they do? For example, even just getting that DI statement. How was the experience? So we could reach out and ask them, so how did you go about this? How many iteration sessions did you have as you're just coming up with your DI statement? Are we just being too much? Because for us, the first time we were trying to just come up with a DI statement, we were a bit confused, like how do we do this? How do we go about it? So just talking to our peers around the cohorts, we realized that we're in the right direction. You'll even have 6, 7 iterations of DI statements, but eventually through the guidance of the coach, plus also just looking at what people are doing, you'll be able to get there. Then also in terms of the shared journey, we're still in communication up to date with Jacaranda. We still talk about what is going on in terms of DI. How are we even measuring the success of how far the integration of DI is? So we have quite a number of also materials that we've shared, and through that we've built trust in that we are able to even relate and speak openly about, okay, we were able to do this, we are stuck and we still need to measure these indicators. We are not able to measure this, it's not coming out clear. So there has been a shared journey where you feel part and parcel, and this has really enhanced the ownership of the entire process. And I also want to say this has encouraged this process to be ongoing. It was not a one-off capacity building process, but it's an ongoing journey. Despite the fact Dalberg, yes, they've stopped at some point, but for us, grantees in that cohort, we're still in communication, and we are able to reach out to our fellow cohort members and ask, what is going on with what you're doing? How did you do this? How have you managed to maybe embed this into the community or your different cohorts that you're working with? Then also, it provided that platform of self-reflection and organization introspection, which really encouraged us to interrogate the culture of how does our organization look like, that internally and outwardly as we deal with the community. We realize that we are working at scale right now. We are scaling up the intervention that we are doing. But again, there are different things that we missed out. So we could learn from our fellow grantees who've gone ahead of us in terms of scale up. Just what do you want to look at when you're talking about DI or wanting to embed this as you do the scale up work and all that? What about culture? What about the leadership structures? What about the power dynamics? So we consult and also try and find out ideas. How did you try and address matters of cultural differences and all that as you work through with your beneficiaries or with the people that you work with? So we are able to get also that to just assist each other within the cohorts that we had established, and also highlighted some of the blind points. For us, we were just okay, maybe the way we operate, but also just talking with the different grantees in the cohorts, we realized, okay, we thought this was okay, but it's not okay. Can we look at this? Can we interrogate it? So we moved from just having this policy on paper to now making it practical.
Thank you so much, Nancy. I think really what you're speaking to is two things. One is the power of peer learning and how much you gained from working with other organizations at a different level of maturity in terms of your goals. And then the second is how you have continued to network and build those relationships and learn beyond the bounds of the program as well. And thank you for sharing those very tangible shifts that you experienced. So we have talked a lot so far about the benefits, the impact. What's good about a cohort program. But I'd like to just pivot us briefly towards what are some of the limitations. So in terms of taking a funder perspective, what are the limits of this cohort model in terms of delivering the kind of impact you hoped for? And what more would you wish you could achieve through a cohort program? What still feels lacking? Let's start with Cece and then we'll go to Linda.
Thank you, Tanya. I think some of the challenges are really related to, organizations being able to prioritize what they really would like to focus on, right? Sometimes, especially in a dynamic where the cohort is being supported through a funder, there could be assumptions about how the funder wants the cohort to participate, right? And how they want the cohort to what kind of outcomes and evaluation that the foundation is prioritizing related to the cohort. So I'll share a little bit of insights, but one of the first opportunities that we had to bring the Racial Equity 2030 cohort together was in South Africa, and this was 2023. It was a wonderful experience. We had brought in a lot of partners to Johannesburg to be able to have a shared learning experience along with some of our other initiatives. During that time, we had some opportunity to work through and kind of design a specific space for the cohort to come together and provide feedback and insights and ask questions. And a lot of the questions at that time were specifically directed towards the foundation. We had designed that workshop and opportunity space really to be a cross-learning experience, but because this was really the first time that they had the opportunity to interact with the foundation in that capacity as well as each other, a lot of them had questions for us about what our expectations were in, being able to bring them all together and how much we were asking them to align together in some capacity. And I think that was the perfect opportunity to be able to clearly share that, our interest was not in trying to create conformity or some sort of shared outcome related to the work that they're doing. As Sonia shared, the work of these partners is very diverse, like very different, right, from each other. And so what we really wanted to emphasize was this is the opportunity to find threads of commonality, to build trust amongst the cohort members, and just really have that learning exchange with each other. And that's where we wanted this to be centered and not to worry about what the foundation was trying to get out of this. Of course, as a foundation, we like to know, what are some of the outcomes related to an initiative that we've supported deeply. And in this capacity, this was also one of the very first kind of global challenges that the foundation had ever put out. So we wanted to be positioned in a learning space just as much as we were in our normal funding capacity, right? And so I think that was the perfect opportunity to kind of talk that out loud and then bring that into action, right? And so there was opportunities to really set a set of very, very high level kind of metrics that would help the foundation realize the impact of the cohort and the initiative all together. But again, we wanted it to be in a capacity that was not prescriptive of how each of the partners needed to have any type of shared alliance, but also recognize that in many ways, there are core and root issues that they're trying to address with very, opportunities to address it in systematic ways, right? And that there might be some cross-learning in those, the ways that they're approaching their work. So yes, I would say that, for us, that was another learning opportunity for us is like, hey, you need to be clear right up front what your intentions are as a funder, right? And bringing these organizations together. And even though many of them had spent a considerable time going through a process and developing, plans over the next 8 years, there was still opportunity to share why, and help them understand why it was important for us to bring this opportunity forward and why we were especially excited about them being part of it.
Thank you for being so transparent, Susie, about limitations there. Curious to ask the same question to you then, Linda, about limitations you see in a cohort model.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tanya. And Cece, I couldn't agree more. I think, yeah, you really summed it up so well in terms of, the need to manage the power dynamic in essence, right, between funder and grantee partner, and being clear about not being too prescriptive. But then also, how do you then translate this into, showcasing impact of this work, which I love the point you made about, framing it as a learning space and allowing for outcomes to emerge over time. Maybe to add to that, I mean, I'll speak again specifically about limitations related to the DI capacity building cohort program we did. And Nancy, please do add to this, of course, from your perspective and Ujamaa's perspective. But I think in addition to what Cece said, one of the main challenges is also, or limitations, is also actually around making the right level of resources and time available for this work, right? So one of the questions that we asked ourselves is, how do you deliver this program effectively, efficiently? How do you balance breadth versus depth of support? Because the intention is to scale this approach to as many partners as possible based on demand, right? We do see cohort-based capacity strengthening as a key tool in our toolbox to build ecosystem resilience. That's not going to change, especially now at a time when we know civic space is challenged and organizational development and strategic collaboration has become even more important. But, there's a lot of sort of the devil in the detail in terms of practical delivery, right? So Nancy earlier mentioned that, some of these networks that were built through the DI program persists, and there's, work that the grantee partners are continuing to do, but also the formal part of the program itself was, of course, time bound. And, what we found is there was a lot of additional demand from our grantee partners to receive more dedicated support, which we couldn't provide at the time. And so thinking longer term, what does it look like when grantee partners actually need and want more ongoing support? I think in relation to DI, the second challenge for us was really the complexity of the topic as well. So, as Nancy said, different organizations approach DI very differently, right? And that meant that we needed varying levels of support. So anything from one-on-one coaching through to broader leadership training, support with developing policies and action plans. And so again, how do you manage the breadth and the depth of support that is required? And then I think practically as well, one limitation that we found was around balancing in-person versus virtual engagements. What we found, and again, Nancy, feel free to challenge me on this, but the in-person workshops that we also participated in worked really well. Like, this is where we saw really thoughtful peer exchange and, deep community building. And so making more time for these types of engagements is essential, but is also not always possible, resource or time-wise. So yeah, some additional things to think about in terms of practical limitations.
Thank you for being so tactical with your response there, Linda, because I think that will provide a lot of insight to people thinking about doing this kind of program. So thank you for that. So I want to shift us now into a bit of a lightning round, given we have 6 or so minutes left. So we've talked a little bit about shifting power, and I'd like to hear from, in this instance, both Sonia and Cece, who are on both sides of the coin in the same program. So lightning round will give you sort of between 30 seconds and 60 seconds to just say a little bit more about how the cohort program has really shifted the relationship between grant maker and grantee and how it can help build trust and cohesion. So we will start with Sonia and then move to Cece.
Thank you, Tanya. I would say it's the cohort program in the context of that 8-year partnership, which again is very rare in the philanthropy world. And I find myself and my teammates, because of that unique structure, we're giving ourselves the permission to be a bit more open and vulnerable in the ways that we might have been more hesitant to do if this were a one-year partnership that we're putting pressure on ourselves trying to renew at the end of the year. Like, for example, like we're coming up on the end of our year three of our partnership. And during those 3 years, CC would know this, we've had significant challenges. Some are completely unexpected. Some are just reflections of the world we're living in now. And some are just difficult strategic choices that we had to make. And I found myself not rushing to present a solution to CC and say things like, we figured it out, we know how to move forward. Instead of doing that, I'm taking a step back and CC, here are the things we're learning from these experiences. We haven't figured it all out yet. It's going to take some time for us to thoughtfully present a path forward, but this is where we are and here's what we're learning. And I'm doing the same with my cohort members. I'm sharing those lessons more transparently with this group of people because I've seen them and interacted with them over the past 3 years. This is not a group that I share something very vulnerable and we all disappear and I don't know how this information is used. We trust each other enough to share lessons like that transparently. So that's really a unique benefit of this cohort-based model in the context of an 8-year partnership.
I thank you, Sonia. I'm glad you went first because I was like, I want to know what your perspective is as, you know, being part of the cohort. And I think exactly that. I think the arc of the longer term partnership moves us from transactional to relationship driven. Over the 8 years that we'll be in partnership, like Sonia shared, we get to learn not only about the great outcomes as you often get reported in annual type of report styles, but you get to hear all of the nuanced stuff that's happening engaged around the learning for everybody, right? And I think it really, you know, that transactional shorter term can reinforce some of the power imbalances. And to shift power, we really need to build and think in longer term capacity in relationships. I also think the cohort model, you know, gives an opportunity for collective voice over individual kind of ways that might be set up through traditional funding structures, right? They don't have to vie against each other for potential next rounds of funding. Instead, they gain a collective leverage, right? To be able to shape some of the learning agendas and surface, you know, some of the ways that they want to advocate, maybe with a more united voice, right? And so I think that those are really, you know, some of the opportunities to shift power and think about how we move not only in our funding capacity, but also beyond the money, right? Create access to networks, visibility, and shared infrastructure as well as part of that, that model.
Yeah, and the longer time horizon seems to be so important here in the way that power has been shifted, at least within this particular cohort model. So one more question then for Nancy. If we could just do a very quick lightning 30 to 60 second response. I would love to hear from you, Nancy. If you would have one piece of advice for a funder, either thinking about doing a cohort program for the first time or wanting to do it better, what advice would you give?
So from the experience, the advice I want to give is just for the funders to make sure there's flexibility and contextualizing the realities on the ground, and not to use the approach of one size fits all, quote unquote. Like, let them just be flexible and understand that yes, the organizations are together, they're different grantees, but again, the realities are totally different when it comes to, maybe I'll use a good example, which is DI. Yeah, the realities are totally different. Then one last one, I know you asked for one, but I want to do a second one just to put emphasis on what Linda had said. Can we also encourage collective action beyond the cohorts? Can we have support networks? Can we have communities of practice? So those are my two advices that I will want to give to anyone who wants to do the cohort model.
Yes, we should bank those questions, those pieces of advice, Nancy, for anyone wishing to do this. All right. So final question then. Cece, over to you just to bring us home. And what I'd love to ask you is taking a step back and thinking about if more funders took a cohort approach, what kind of impact do you think we might see over the next 5 to 10 years in the social impact sector?
Oh, wow. Yeah, I think if more funders were to engage in this practice and really, as outlined by so many on the call today, thought about the nuances within that, right? I think there could be considerable impacts. It's really in that vein and in that movement towards more trust-based philanthropy and thinking about how communities are driving solutions, not only to the outcomes and impact directly related to their work, but also in the process, how you show up in relationship and how you support these kind of opportunities is critically important to those outcomes as well, right? I think impact and positioning yourself in a learning space around that is a critical, important way to approach the work and to build that trusting longer term relationship with your partners. The reality is that most of the funding is not done in this capacity, right? Most of the funding is still done in what you might consider more traditional ways of one-on-one relationships, a little more of a transactional feel. But there is so much opportunity to learn from some of the examples that were shared today. And one of the comments that I left in to a question that was in this webinar was, peer-to-peer engagement is a critical tool. And so if your leadership hasn't fully, bought into the opportunities to build this kind of model or cohort opportunity, then maybe engaging another peer, right, that, has had some success in being able to build this, to have that more formed example, to be able to share with them and some of the insights and really start the conversation at a level 10 instead of, feeling like, they have to learn and engage in different spaces can be really a great opportunity to learn and share the experience.
Thank you, Cece. So I'm really hearing some of the value here about really driving not just impact broadly, but also driving and increasing trust-based philanthropy, really with a learning mindset. And then I love that piece at the end, answering that question from the chat around engaging with peers. All right, so we have run out of time. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. What a very rich discussion from all the panelists. Appreciate so much your insights, and we will be sharing this recording with those on the call and those who could not make it as well. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.